Happy to be here, and I was also super happy to see some familiar faces or photos of faces in the list of participants here today. So hi to all the familiar faces there, and also very happy to see that there are a bunch of people who I don't actually know, which is what one also always hopes when talking in a series like this. So hopefully something for everybody here in the talk today. And so, as Andy said, I'm going to be talking about the trouble with sharing. So what are the kinds of things that make it difficult to do peer-to-peer exchange, and especially focusing on the interpersonal challenges there. So we often hear criticisms in the kind of broad discourses around the sharing economy about how capitalism is making things difficult, and it's the business models and it's the platforms, this and that. But actually today where I want to push us to think about is the interpersonal side of things. So how is it that it is actually often the interactions with other people that might be part of the problem here that makes it a little difficult. But to get us going, I think, there we go. It's good maybe to back up a little bit and start on the basics. So what is peer-to-peer exchange? What do I mean when I say that? So here I'm thinking of various types of sharing, but all of them involving the transfer of valued resources, goods and services among members of a local community or between parties who haven't met before the exchange encounter. So it might be both that you're doing things together with your neighbors, or it might be that you're traveling the world and you're connecting to somebody you haven't had any connection with and no familiarity with beforehand. So both things there. And also peer-to-peer exchange involves online systems. So that's why it's something that we study in a computer science setting. And these systems are designed to allow strangers, or again, it might also be local community members, to exchange in ways that typically previously were confined to the realm of kinship and friendship. And here you might think of systems like Couchsurfing and Airbnb that allow people to organize homestays. And that's, of course, the kind of thing that people have been doing for a very, very long time in the history. But the idea that you would then organize something like this with people that you don't know and just welcome strangers to your home in some cases is a little bit new. And that's what's kind of making peer-to-peer exchange interesting in this sense. And important to those examples of Airbnb and Couchsurfing is that some of the arrangements we're talking about today involve money. So it might be that there is someone paying another person for a service or for the hospitality that they're receiving, or whatever the issue might be. It might be that people are gifting or selling used goods and so on and so forth. And then other examples are systems that explicitly ban participants from using it, and Couchsurfing is here the kind of most typical example. So for those of you maybe not familiar with Couchsurfing, it's similar to Airbnb, or the original early idea of Airbnb, of people renting out their homes or a spare room in their home. But what Couchsurfing does differently is that the hosts are not allowed to receive payment for the hospitality they're offering, and rather there's an expectation that over time everybody gets to be both a host and a guest and reciprocate in different ways on the level of the community, which makes for quite an interesting setup socially to run it like that, where money, of course, is something that can make things quite straightforward in terms of handling reciprocity. And then finally, third thing to think about here is that digital technology can play very different roles. So oftentimes when we're looking at this space, we're thinking of digital platforms of different types. And that's definitely been the kind of main research focus for the first 10 years of this type of research. But then sometimes there might be different ways of organizing the technology around it. And this is especially true for the more locally oriented arrangements. So it might be that people are setting up Facebook groups to do different things, or they might have a various kind of sets of technologies that they piece together, rely on a Google Doc there and on WhatsApp there, and different kinds of tools might come into play. And sometimes there may be very little technology involved. So you can think of those kinds of setups where there might be a little bookshelf or a windowsill somewhere in an apartment building where people leave books that they are happy to let someone else take after they themselves are done reading them. So So little arrangements like that can be thought of as peer-to-peer exchange. So it's a very diverse phenomenon that we're looking at here. And what I'm arguing is that often, while technology is of course important here and can allow for a lot of things and can also constrain activities in different ways, the trickiest challenges often have to do more with social interaction than with technical features per se. And just as a little side note and shout out to organizations that have been funding the work here. I've been doing work on these topics for more than a decade, so I'm not going to be mentioning quite everyone, but most recently I have a Swedish Research Council project still running on economic encounters for human-computer interaction, and part of the work here has been done in that scope. And then just a week or so ago, we came to a close with our sharing and caring cost action. So that's been a research network across Europe that's focused on socio-technical aspects of the collaborative economy. And I'll have a link to the website of the action at the end of my talk. If you want to take a look, there's plenty of resources on that website for anyone who's interested in activity in this space, and also the kind of different researchers doing work in this domain across Europe. And I guess the final thing to note before we move on is that the work that I'm drawing on here is various empirical studies we've done over the years. Most of it has been collaborative work. So while it's just me talking today, there are a lot of people to thank for with the work. And I'll give you pointers to where to see who are all the people who've been involved as well as we go along. So I'm here just as a representative for the research more than just trying to argue that it would be me doing all the work. And the scope of the research has been kind of in terms of geography and cultures. These are studies based in Europe and to an extent in the US, so it's not speaking to the world on the whole. And one thing that might be interesting to take up in the Q&A as well, if there are people in the room who have thoughts and expertise, would be to think about how these issues might be coming up elsewhere in the world and what's applicable from this to settings that are different from the ones I've been studying. So with that said, the focus today and how I'm roughly going to be organizing the conversation from here will be to focus on 3 different interpersonal challenges, which really is just a fancy way of saying how people deal with each other. So dealing with other people is often a big part of what makes this type of sharing difficult. And some issues, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but three interesting domains that I want to bring up today are reciprocity and indebtedness. So how do people negotiate those issues, especially when they can't just rely on money to even things out? Then closeness and intimacy come up a lot whenever people are trying to connect, and there might be hopes for having a meaningful encounter and socializing a little bit. And then at the same time, as soon as it becomes too much, that can be very awkward and uncalled for. So balancing those issues is another thing that makes encounters with strangers quite challenging. And then thirdly, there are questions around participation and inclusion that we need to consider, and kind of interestingly, both in terms of who gets to be involved, but then also in terms of who might be pulled into activities that they weren't actually wanting to take part in. So that's the basic storyline, and the big argument I'm going to give away my main line early in the talk is that we can have nice things, but we can't have them without working for them. So I'll talk a lot about the work of sharing and the effort that's needed for a lot of these sociable encounters to come about, and how people aren't always necessarily wanting to do that work. But this is a key point I hope you're walking away with today, that it is possible to have these nice things and the kind of positive side of sharing that many are appealed by. But then at the same time, we shouldn't be naive in thinking that that's gonna come easily or is something that we can just buy as a service. So that's a theme we'll come back to with the various examples. And I think this is something that's worth thinking of, both in terms of how each of us are participants in various exchange arrangements. So you might be taking part in something that's kind of readily recognizable as peer-to-peer exchange, but then I'd say that all of us encounter these issues in some form. It might be just a shared kitchen at your workplace, where there's always a conversation or who should be taking care of the dishes, or or how much to talk in the open space office and so on and so forth. So we are all in some ways involved in the trouble of sharing these days. But then also, of course, more so for those of you who are researchers in the room, I think there are lots here for us to think about in terms of how we do research and how we might do design to support the efforts that we need to undertake. And a few disclaimers before we get into the empirical portion. So first of all, oftentimes what I'm going to be talking about is labeled as the sharing economy, and that's still the term that comes up the most, especially in popular discussions. And what I just want to say here is that I don't think it's an analytically useful term in any ways. It's been used a lot and used in many different ways, and there's kind of a big clash between the ideals of what a sharing economy might be and the realities of how things have unfolded. There you might think of Airbnb as one example, but then also a lot of other systems where there might be quite high-minded goals to begin with, and all kinds of nice stories of how people come together and make new connections and save resources, and it's sustainable and saves money and And then in practice, this isn't always quite how things pan out. So big discrepancies there. There are very different technologies involved, as I was already mentioning there earlier. So it's not just about platforms, but that's also something that often with the sharing economy term kind of leads people to think about the big platforms. And then what we saw, especially with the cost action work, is that there's actually such a big wealth of different local initiatives that might not be having their own technologies at all, but are still doing very, very interesting things and finding ways to operate with the help of digital technology, but in different ways than one would think if we take big platforms as the starting point. And then thirdly, the discourses are super, super messy in this space. So the term has been used in very different ways, and it's been co-opted in different ways, that it's not really helpful to be talking about the sharing economy at this point in my mind. And rather than, if that word comes up, I would encourage you to think about asking a few questions to scope down the conversation. Think about what's being exchanged, how are people reciprocating, how common is it for people to take part on both sides of the arrangement. So are they actually acting as peers, or is it more of a service provider and a customer setup, and so on and so forth? And I think those kinds of considerations can really help in getting to a conversation about the specific thing, rather than having to have all over the fight about what the sharing economy is, which some of you might have been involved in over the years, more times than you care to count. And then secondly, another disclaimer that I think is important to bring up is that peer-to-peer exchange is, of course, not a new thing. So the sharing economy has been around as a phenomenon now for more than a decade, but more importantly than that, a lot of the things that we're encountering here and that I'm going to be talking about today are very, very old and kind of basic parts of human society, I would even say. So there's, of course, a lot of research to pull from way before the platforms came into being. So we can think of sociological work and anthropological work around social exchange and reciprocity. There's a lot of work, again, in the social sciences and in the hospitality studies, specifically around hospitality and how sociable encounters are created and managed. And then we can also look at the more economic and technological side of things, think about research on online marketplaces and exchange platforms. Things like eBay often get ignored when we start talking about the sharing economy, but a lot of the issues are similar here as well. So there are lots of connection points to keep in mind. And if we think of human-computer interaction, then one obvious big area of study is all of the online communities and community informatics studies that have been conducted over the years. So there's a wealth of work that has been done and that we can build on. So it's not an all new and shiny domain that we're working in. And with that, I think it's time for us to dive into the first challenge. So thinking about reciprocity and indebtedness. And there I want to take you back to Helsinki in like 2008, I think is around the time we we started working there on a system that initially was called scarcity, with the idea of doing something a little bit like crowdsourcing, but for the students in the university campus. So campus sourcing is the origin of the name there. And later on, that system has evolved into a company called ShareTribe that's still running. So it's one of those research projects that actually ended up creating something that kept going well beyond the tenure of the project itself. But as this system was being built in the research project, and with the idea that we would set it up and see what the students might want to do with the system, where they can post things, both stuff that they need and also offer things that they could let others use. So it might be both that they have something like a tent or a guitar or something that they don't need all the time, and other people might want to have it for a while, or they could also offer to help with particular things and so on and so forth. But the core concern we had in the team at the time was this fear of free riding and how to counteract it. So we were really worried about, will some people be taking advantage of others, and how should we deal with that, and with this whole kind of like, well, will there be a lot of bad actors in the community who will just ruin this thing that was supposed to be a nice and helpful resource for the community. But then at some point, of course, came the point where it was time to launch the system and just figure out what will actually happen if we let people try it out. And what we ended up seeing in our research when we interviewed people who'd been taking part in exchanges through this system was that more than free riding and more than worrying about getting taken advantage of, they were actually worried about debts of gratitude. So they were really averse to indebtedness. And some were even talking a lot about how kind of they were shying away from participating if they weren't quite sure how or when they could reciprocate. So if the expectation was a little bit like the couchsurfing example, that over time everybody gets to do things and it's all right to just accept something, and then later on, for sure, there will be ways for everyone to contribute. This wasn't quite enough for the participants, and that to us was a really kind of moment of revelation, like, oh, that can actually also be a problem for getting a system like this started, where people are almost kind of too kind, because it's, of course, the norm of reciprocity, and people wanting to reciprocate is a really positive thing, and it's great when that norm is in place. But then for a system like this, it can also become a problem, because you need both kind of giving and taking for the system to run. So you can't have an exchange system where it's just everybody who first wants to be offering something, and only after that will they be agreeing to receive something from others themselves. So we encountered this issue of getting the engine started, and how reciprocity and indebtedness was actually a core thing to think about, and how finding ways to make it visible in the system that different kind of contributions matter, and that it's actually welcome to take part in different capacities was something that we then needed to think about for the system. But that, I think, has been one kind of revelation from the research that's really stuck with me, where it's really easy to be kind of focused on the classic sides of trouble, like everybody agrees that free riding in a system like this can be problematic, but then the flip side of it can equally become a problem. And that's something that's interesting to keep in mind, and also think about how we might work around that kind of problem and find ways to encourage people to get going, even if they are uncomfortable in those ways. And to just explain a little bit what happened and what we saw from the interviews we did here was that people did start reciprocating directly in little ways. So they might bring some small gift to a person who was giving them something that they no longer used, and that was kind of not expected to be a full reciprocation. So it wasn't a form of payment, but rather different ways of showing appreciation, making the effort really smooth for the person who was doing the act of kindness, and so on and so forth. So finding ways to negotiate this space. Then the second example I want to bring you in is then the domain of network hospitality. So the homestays I already mentioned earlier, and this, I think, is the easiest example for thinking about closeness and intimacy, and how it can come into being, because this is really a domain where what starts online doesn't stay online. So people do use these platforms like Couchsurfing and Airbnb to connect with one another, and guests are finding hosts through there. But then, of course, when it comes to the actual exchange or the moment of having a place to stay, you do end up knocking on a physical door and entering an actual home. And in this case, we were studying people who were hosting through these platforms and were doing so in their own homes. So of course, especially on Airbnb now, we see a lot of things happening where it's not somebody's home, and it's no longer that kind of a sociable situation either. But if we think back to those cases where it is somebody actually welcoming a stranger to stay in their home and use their guest room, or maybe letting them use the whole apartment while they are away themselves, then necessarily it's quite an intimate setting where you get close to another person, or you get close to their possessions, which also can be quite intimate. And you might have had that experience yourself where you barely meet the host when you're staying somewhere, but if their family photos are all over the apartment and you can see their books and things and see what's in the fridge, it still feels like you're in an intimate space. And the focus here, of course, often in thinking about how people navigate the terrains of closeness and intimacy is on the host-guest relationship, and that's the classical starting point. And there's lots to be said between just that dyadic relationship. But what I think is even more interesting, and what's been the focus for my research here, has been to think about everybody else that's also part of the story, and especially thinking about cases where there are multiple people in the household who's hosting. So it might be a couple who's hosting, or a family, or sometimes a set of housemates who welcome visitors. And that, of course, means that there needs to be negotiations, not just between the host and the guest, but also within the hosting entity, where it might be that there's somebody in the household who's really eager to be hosting, or another's one not so keen. Or there might be different situations where within the domestic space, there are areas that everybody feels it's fine for the guests to be using, and then other parts of the home that are off limits, like in the case of housemates, often there might be the living room and the kitchen and so on and so forth, where everybody is welcome to be bringing guests, but then the individual rooms of everyone are off limits unless specifically agreed upon. And those kinds of negotiations are something where platforms, or at least Couchsurfing and Airbnb, are not great at supporting that kind of work. They kind of do the basics and help people to connect, but then once it gets to the granular details of how actually the visits should unfold, people are largely on their own to figure these things out, and that's where trouble can arise. And then, of course, thinking beyond just the home unit as such, we might think more broadly of the influence on neighbors and also in some cases whole neighborhoods. So it might be that the hosts are in agreement about what they're doing, but then in an apartment building, the neighbors might have different feelings about how their surroundings are changing if there are all of a sudden a lot of new people coming and going on a regular basis. And with Airbnb, many of you have probably seen debates over the last years around how entire neighborhoods might be quite run over by Airbnb visitors. Now less so during the pandemic, but before that, Barcelona was one big example where people were getting very, very unhappy about how things are changing when areas that used to be quite kind of dedicated for the people living there long term were all of a sudden run over by tourists who wanted to see some of that local life, but then with their presence in big numbers were changing the flavor of the neighborhoods entirely. So those kinds of dynamics also come up and start changing encounters, but going from the closeness and the encounters, it becomes just interesting to think about how it might be that there's there's both these very kind of face-to-face conversations and figuring out how to navigate the different times where people are awake and how to share the kitchen and all of that stuff that might be hard enough as it is, and then going to bigger and bigger scales, we might end up needing to think of things changing on the level of entire neighborhoods. So a lot of things going on here, and a lot of it not to do directly with just how a technology is set up to facilitate an exchange between peers, but then having a lot of implications that weren't necessarily thought of to begin with. And then thirdly, I wanted to bring an example from work we did on a peer-to-peer exchange system that we were setting up for a single parents network in California. So this was the same system we studied in Helsinki, but then this particular community in California was looking to set up a system that would allow their members to come together and do different kinds of exchanges and essentially help each other out. And here I think for the themes of participation and inclusion, it's a good example about how it's often not just money that might be keeping people out, even though that can definitely be the case. And it may also not just be a matter of are people motivated enough to take part. So what we saw when we were talking with the members of the network and trying to figure out what was going on there was that for many of them, scarcity of time rather than money was actually the bigger barrier to participation. And here's one member we interviewed who was explaining it quite well. So part of the problem with being a single parent is it's kind of a vicious circle. Because you're a single parent, you tend to not have enough time. Because you don't have enough time, it's harder to get the resources that you would need to make being a single parent easier. So essentially what this person is describing is something that in the literature has been called the scarcity trap. So once you're low on a particular resource, that in itself makes it harder for you to gain more of that resource, and you kind of just get trapped in your scarcity. And this can happen, of course, with money, but in this case, it was more the time that was coming up and making it hard for them to take part, even if many of them were really keen on having this kind of support and connecting with others who were sharing the identity as single parents with them. And here in particular, I think what was making it harder here than in the student community case in Helsinki was that the kind of exchanges the people were interested in making were often ones that would have required quite a bit of trust. So they were hoping to organize carpools or organize childcare and so on and so forth, often things that involve their children. And then, of course, the stakes become much higher than if you think of college students and they are circulating old textbooks or helping each other out in different ways on the university campus. So their risk takes on completely different meanings in these two settings. But then another thing we learned about how participation and inclusion work, and thinking a little bit more structurally here, is that matching matters a lot, and it isn't so easy to get it right. And what I mean here is that if you're setting up an exchange system, there need to be people involved in it, but you also need to have people in some ways on two sides of a market, so that you can find people who have something and others who want that thing, and so on and so forth. And what seemed to be happening here was that it wasn't so straightforward to find good matches. So on the one hand, like in the description here, while all of the members of the network were single parents, they were actually very different from one another. And so they did have this shared identity, and they did have some shared experiences, but then depending on the ages of their children and their history of being a single parent, some of them were that by choice, others not by choice. Some had adopted their children, and so on and so forth. It just became very difficult to necessarily find the kinds of pairings where it would have made sense to team up together for the kinds of exchanges that the members were hoping to do. And that was kind of one interesting part of it. But then also beyond that, and relating back to the first point around scarcity, was that it was also becoming obvious that they were all kind of short on the same kinds of resources, and then it might have been better if the system had been set up in a way where there would have been the single parents and their children on the one hand, and then maybe elderly people from the local community who wished they had grandchildren but didn't, and they might have been a better fit to support with some of the needs here. And then again, how to bring those groups together into an online system would have been a different challenge, but something to think about, where just having a shared identity doesn't necessarily mean that it then becomes straightforward to exchange together. And those kinds of issues come up a lot in different realms, and might be then hindering participation, or might mean that it becomes difficult to include some groups over the others. So that's, and I'm looking at the time, and I think it's maybe soon to start wrapping up. So some tensions to sum up a little bit related to the work of sharing, and as we've seen hopefully a little bit with these examples, hasty as they've been, is that there is quite a lot of work involved in making these kinds of encounters work. People need to think about how they get around to doing things, how they interact with each other, and also maybe would do well to reflect a little bit on the implications of those exchanges on people who aren't directly involved or may not have chosen to be involved per se. So one thing is this tension between engaging as a customer versus a community member. And this, I think, is something that comes up as a big challenge in the sharing economy conversations often. So many people find the ideas of having these local tool sharing setups and so forth quite appealing, but then in their day-to-day life can find it quite difficult to take part. And I think a big part of it is that most of us are really used to being customers in different settings and just getting easy access to services without really needing necessarily to show up ourselves so much as people and contributing to a broader scheme around us. And a lot of the locally flavored work just really needs us to show up as community members rather than customers. And then with that comes different kinds of responsibilities and different kind of work. So that's one tension that comes up a lot. Another one that we've talked a lot about, and this is something we've written together with Barry in kind of talking about Airbnb and Couchsurfing and how those two systems are different, is whether in setting up a system there's a priority on convenience. Like if we think of Airbnb, it's nowadays super easy to book a stay through Airbnb. You don't need to be negotiating with anybody. A lot of the time you can just find a place you want and you book it, and that's it. Whereas if we think of Couchsurfing, where you still very much need to reach out to the host, see if they are willing to welcome you, and are they willing to welcome you at the time you'd like to go, and arrange everything, and the system doesn't do much of that work for the users, which is inconvenient, takes a lot of effort, but then also actually ends up being very important for the interpersonal outcomes that Couchsurfing can bring about, where people actually end up meeting each other and building up a bit of trust to one another as well, already ahead of the visit, in a way that doesn't happen if the whole thing gets arranged with a few clicks online. Then thirdly, questions around who is involved, and this we've talked a little bit about already, but there I think a tension that's interesting to highlight is the issues around diversity and homophily, which is a sociological term meaning the tendency of people to want to socialize with others who are like them. So birds of a feather wanting to flock together. And this is something that especially early on was coming up quite a bit in the sharing economy stories, where people were wanting to engage with the idea that they would be encountering other interesting people, and especially when traveling, there's this desire to stay in local neighborhoods and see the local lifestyle and all of that. But then actually what often seems to happen is that people are still looking for strangers that aren't so strange to them, so looking for people that in some ways actually are quite similar to themselves. And then that of course, when taken together, might mean that diversity suffers, and some groups may also find that they have a disproportionately hard time to take part. And then finally, it's, I think, important here to ask what counts as a success. A lot of the more locally oriented sharing economy systems have come and gone over the years, and it's easy to think of them as failure, but then I'd say there's definitely room to think about scaling on the one hand and local focus on the other, where not everything necessarily is aiming to grow into a big system over time or become a business at all. And then some of the locally oriented efforts might be even quite short-lived and still have served their purpose. So I think that's one idea that's good to keep in mind, that maybe not everything needs to become big and permanent to matter here. And to close, I just wanted to pull out this little quote from Al Roth, who works in market design in economics. And this is his call for economists, but I think this also goes for us working on different branches of digitalization and doing design and studying technology. So if we think of markets and different economic arrangements as something that we can design and that are human-made artifacts, then that gives us a lot of room to intervene, think of alternatives, fix things that we think are broken, and also start to create new things where we think those might be helpful. So I think that's the kind of work that I hope the community will be doing in the years to come. And I close there. Just wanted to put in a little shameless plug for my book that came out earlier this year. So you'll find a lot of research there and pointers to the original papers as well. So you'll see who's been involved, but definitely a lot more in the examples I talked about today. And another thing that I wanted to promote is the sharing and caring cost action that came to a close. The website is going to stay up, and there are a lot of resources there and nice pointers to work around Europe. So that might be something for some of you to check out. And now over to questions. Thank you.